And I'm going to hide these controls. There we go.
Well, hello everybody. I can't say good morning. Apparently there are people from Western Canada and the UK listening to us, so it's morning, afternoon, and all the rest of it. But anyway, welcome. As you can see in the slide there, the first slide, this is the Victoria Bridge in Montreal. In the background, for those of you who don't know, that's the city of Montreal. The bridge looks like that today, but it was a bit different when it was built because the river today is much narrower than it was because of the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's a faster current today, still deep though. It used to have a giant freeze up when the bridge was built. We no longer have the freeze up. And it used to be very difficult to cross the ice when the ice was breaking. You had giant icebergs coming down the river. So the bridge today is in a very different situation than what it was when it was built 150 years ago. Well, the building of the bridge, what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why it was built, when it was built, who built it, how it was built. But I want you to keep in mind the impact in all these different areas. I don't want to mention the word impact too much, but the bridge had a huge impact on Canadian life, as you'll see. Those are just symbols of some of the impacts we're going to look at. Well, in 1860, the Prince of Wales laid the first stone of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, and that's that. The last stone in the Victoria Bridge. It looked very different then to what it does now. Look, it's a metal tube that you can see here. There's the city, that's Mount Royal in the background, Montreal. This is a giant raft going through. These are not people who are standing with they're tiny figures of people. The rafts were enormous then, and they posed a real threat to the bridge. And that's part of the reason why they have these peculiar shaped stone built piers here. I'll take that in a minute. The train here is just coming through. See this smoke? It was a tunnel, if you like, a metal tunnel with no way of the smoke escaping at first. We'll talk about that in a second, but you get the idea how the bridge looked at that time. It's very different to what it looks today. Well, who designed the bridge? This guy did, mainly, a man called Robert Stephenson. He was only one of the many fine engineers. People forget about the engineers who operated before the bridge was built and when it was being built. The engineers were critical for understanding how it was done. They designed 25 tubular spans. These are big tubes, you'll see them in a minute, made from the latest wrought iron and welding techniques. Wrought iron is hammered, it doesn't rust easily. This was a new technique developed in Britain that came to Canada. He died in 1859, just after the bridge was finished, but he was also the son of George Stephenson. He's the British inventor of the rocket. So this guy and his family had a huge impact globally. So keep that in mind. He was dead though when the bridge was finished, and the engineers who survived all fought amongst themselves about who designed what. There's great, I don't want to enter that, but there's great dispute. They all claim that they designed this, they designed that, but I'm not going to mention that too much. Well, the workers. Start off with them, the navvies, the Grand Trunk navvies. We're called navvies because in the 18th century, they used to dig the canals. They navigated the canals. And that's how the word navvy came about. They were the biggest group of workers. You can see them here. Interesting thing, an American passing through Montreal saw them digging this, and they used to sing. They sang songs while they were digging. Okay, they came over from Ireland mainly, but they weren't all Irish, a lot of Scots, English. There were very few French Canadians because the company tried very hard to hire them, but they wouldn't work on the bridge. There were quite a few English Quebecers worked on the bridge, and at least one from around about the Lachute area worked on the bridge. So the bridge attracted workers, not many from Canada, but most of them actually came from Britain, especially the skilled workers. So the navvies, there were about 5,000 of them, mainly from Britain. The majority were Irish Catholics, Irish Protestants, but there were Scots, there were English Canadians, and there were First Nations people on the bridge. I'll talk about them in a minute. They're usually totally ignored in history. It's a great shame, but I'll mention them in a few minutes. The riveters and the stonemasons were really important because you'll see in a few minutes, they were highly paid because they were highly skilled men. Riveting was invented on the Clyde, River Clyde in Scotland. That's why the Clyde became a world shipbuilding place, because they riveted before anybody else did. But the riveters came over to North America to work. They were very highly paid, as were the stonemasons. They're also ignored in history, but they were very important, as you see from the amount of stonework done on the bridge. Well, this is a photograph of the first great big stone taken from the river, done by this man, William Notman. Notman actually photographed the bridge from beginning to end. And it's the first time in the world that was ever done. If you go to the McCorn Museum, you can see all his photographs. And it's a terrific feat. Notman made a lot of money out of it. And he later on, he owned a huge chain of photograph shops. So this was the first, in many ways, one of the ways is we have records of it being built. Here's how they did it. Well, this is a cofferdam, it's called. It's made of wood. They erected the stone piers inside this. This thing was built and sunk in the river. Then they pump out the water. Then they put machines to dig down into the subsoil, down to the rock. What happened was it was very expensive building them. So they developed a floating cofferdam, first in the world, and they still use it today, apparently in parts of the world. This thing floats, sinks, then they can do something inside, then it comes up again. That's one of the many inventions. It was actually the first in the world to do it. The First Nation people, they delivered the stonework. It was built in here to the cofferdams, and this led them to working in skyscrapers and other projects throughout Canada and the USA. The First Nations guys were very important because they learned to put the rocks into the rafts, but they did take the rocks out again. And they were working on the high wire stuff, and they still do that today. But you can see steamboats were very important. Steam is a very important thing. Here is that big stone that they took out. They did a big ceremony placing the emigrant stone. The bridge it was paid for by the bridge workmen. The workmen got together, they were very moved. What happened was when they built the piers, the first pier that came onto the soil on the Montreal side was over the top of a giant graveyard for victims of the famine. They had to move all the bodies, and they moved them up somewhere else. And here's what it is today. To preserve from sorry, I can't read it. The remains of the immigrants. This stone is erected by the workers of Petro, Barassi, and Betts, who constructed the bridge. The railway company donated the land for the stone, and it's still there, as those of you who live in Montreal will know. But the sad thing is, it's ignored. There's a 4-lane highway. It's in the middle of a 4-lane highway, goes around it. You can't really go to it, but it really is a unique memorial, because it's a cairn. A cairn is a Scots Gaelic word for a memorial site. And that's a memorial site for one of the greatest tragedies in Canadian history, the Irish famine. And it's also a memorial for one of the great triumphs of Canadian history, building the Victoria Bridge. So it's a cairn, and I'm afraid I think the municipal authorities are negligent, as are the provincial and federal authorities. This is a very important site. It'd be a great attraction for tourists if they put it in a good setting, but they don't. We forget history. And I think one of the tragedies is, this is a site for ordinary people. It's to ordinary people. Most of the statues that we have are to great men, or sometimes even a great woman now and again. But most of the things that we have are to great men. Very few remember ordinary people. And I think this is a great shame. It's one of the few in the world that does that. And we should be remembering it more than we do. It's, as I said, we were here. The immigrants were there, but so were the workmen. Well, how did the bridge impact in Canadian life? Keep the word impact in your mind. I'm not going to mention it too much, but it had a huge impact because Canada built railroads, and the railroads built Canada. You'll see what I mean by that in a few minutes. It's an important concept. One of the things they did was a huge inflow of money from Britain for the railway. The Brits funded this thing. And one of the things that happened when they were building it, the governments in Lower Canada, Upper Canada said, look, we're fed up pounds, shillings, pence. It's too awkward. We want a decimal currency, like the dollar. You know, it's units of 100, easy to count. But they didn't know how to introduce the money because the public didn't want it. They said, we don't want money from the Canadian government. It's not worth anything. The British pound was backed by gold. And they said, look, we want the pounds. So they knew they had trouble. So what they did, the money didn't just stimulate jobs, industry, and confidence in Canada. McMaster, who was the paymaster of the bridge, he had a big site set up. He called out the militia at gunpoint. They got the navies to come. They said, right, sign here for your money at gunpoint. So they signed, and they were paid in British pounds, but there were 3,000 of them. So it, you know, it meant that decimal currency replaced the British pound because of all the navies. They took all the money into Montreal, and Montreal was the capital of Canada. You know, industrially, that's how they switched. But they switched over quite painlessly, but they did it at the point of a gun. Well, here's one of the things that happened. British technology was imported and adapted. This is the steam shovel, a huge thing. They brought these things over. They had steam shovels in Britain, but nothing like this. They were huge. They were developed here. Okay, and this is something, again, I'm afraid has been forgotten. This is a steam traveler. This didn't come from Britain. It was invented in Canada. I'll explain it in a minute. This thing travels sideways and up and down. So it can lift rocks up and down and move them sideways. I'll show you in a minute how it works. It's a traveling crane. It travels in several directions, right and left and up and down. It lifts material up, then it moves it to the left or the right. You'll see more of them. And it's a basic design of the big traveling cranes that we have today. But these were the first in North America. They were operated by steam. Now, one of the interesting things is this traveler here. This is when they cut a big tube down the middle to get rid of all the smoke and the steam. The traveler is here, you see it, it's going up and down, and it's lifting something up here, and it can move it across there. Other interesting thing, it's driven by a 14 or a 15 or a 16-year-old boy. Cheap labor, child labor. Now, those days, when you were 14, you were fit to work. Not like today. You seldom fit to work, but operated by a young teenage boy, and I actually taught, I think it was the great-grandson of the kid that did that. He worked for the bridge later, he worked for the trains later, he was the ringmaster. What happened was, to cross the bridge, single track, the driver had to have a ring, a big metal ring, and they had a boy doing this, and the great-grandfather of the kid I taught was the ring boy. And he had his face all bashed up because people would miss and he'd hit him. And the poor guy was badly hurt several times because of this. But you should know this, it was child labor again. We regard it as very cruel, but the Victorians say, hey, he's 16 years old, what do you want? Okay, so the Victorians were very different to us. It was called the 8th wonder of the world because there was more stone used in the Victoria Bridge than in the pyramids. That's one of the 7 wonders of the world. The Victorians were great self-promoters. Okay, here it is here, it's an exaggerated view, but see the huge piers and steamer going under it, there's a train coming out. But in 5 years, the bridge built, they moved 3 million cubic feet of stone. Huge. And 2.5 million cubic feet of timber. And 8,000 tons of metal, all done in time over 5 years. It's an incredible technical feat. Now, it was manufactured in Britain, not North America. What happened, it was all made in, except for the stone, all the metal of the rails were done in Britain, then brought over to Canada. Now, why did you do that? You can see here the start of the tube. There's a traveler up there. I don't know what it's doing, but it's traveling up down there. And here's the single track, here's the men working. You see all these steel supports, they support the metal tubes inside, and they're riveted. You'll see in a minute all these holes. But the techniques required to work with a large amount of wrought iron wasn't available. The Americans didn't do it. The equipment required was much too complex for North America, so they had to do it in Britain. So what they did in Birkenhead, just across from Liverpool, the big port, they built the Canada Ironworks. They built it there and they made the iron for Canada in Birkenhead, put it on boats and shipped it to Montreal. Again, they did it on time, by the way. Incredible feat. This was done. And here you see there's the traveller up there, and there's another one there. Here's the arrowhead being built. They look much bigger because they were much bigger then. I told you the river is much deeper today, so they don't look as formidable. You see the boats going through. Here's a boat here. They also had lifeboats because people fell off the bridge. Around about 20 died, I'm afraid. There's big fights. They don't really know how many because it was done over 5 years. Sometimes the rafts crashed into the stone and they drowned. So there's a big fight. Whose fault was it? The fault of the raftsmen. So again, there's a big debate about how many people were drowned, but people were drowned, but the company had boats ready to save them. Secondly, the company had a hospital built for the workers. They were very progressive, and they had a school for the children. So the company, the hospital was later, I think it became St. Patrick's Hospital. It used to be in Montreal. But these guys, the employers, as I said, were not what we think. The workers weren't what we think either. They were very different. One of the things that happened was that the Americans valued these riveters and stonemasons, and they come up and tried to get them to join, and some of them did. Then the workers went on strike, and Brassey, the guy that built he was the contractor, he'd worked all over the world. He said to the men, he got 2,000 guys, said, right, what are you going to tell your grandchildren? And they're all looking, and he said, I paid for a lot of you to come here, but you're working on the biggest bridge that's ever been built, the longest bridge that's ever been built. And what are you going to tell your grandchildren? That you sabotaged it? Or are you going to tell them, I built the biggest bridge in the world? Think about that. And they all cheered. They went back to work. So he was a different guy, and the Abbeys were different people from what we are. But the design, well, I'm not going to do this. It was Kiefer or Ross who designed the arrow, but it deflected the ice flow, and that was very important then because it was a big problem. Here again, you can see the sheer scale of it here. See all the wood. Here's a raft, little raft here. Here's one. I think it's a rescue boat there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but you can see the sheer amount of material used to build this bridge. It's remarkable. Now, the ironworks were open in Birkenhead to manufacture material, and here's some of the things that these big girders were done. Here's a riveting gang. The gang were not. The gangs weren't employed by Brassey directly. They worked for themselves. They were very highly. They were paid piecework. It's called. They're paid for every piece they do. These guys, the big scandal in Montreal, they were making more money than the British military officers, and that didn't go down well with Montreal at the time. They thought it was disgraceful that these guys were making more money than the colonel of the various British regiments. They were really well. One of the things that happened, though, I repeat, they were very skilled. Many of them stayed and they started small businesses on the Machine Canal. They didn't all leave. A lot went to the States. It's a shame. The Americans give them credit in their history books, but we don't mention them in our history book. They worked in the Machine Canal, or they started small businesses, later grew to big businesses. Okay, they were very important people, these riveting gangs. They use a sort of computer to punch the holes in the rivets, and it's the world's first metal press, especially built for a bridge. They didn't put these these holes for the rivets in, so they put a big machine to do it, and it's the first in the world to do it. 2.5 million rivets, 1.5 million holes, and there was not one mistake in the entire bridge. It was an incredible feat of engineering. Here's the scene again from here's the traveller up here. You can see the tube being put on. See why they use so much wood to climb up, and you can see right across the river. See the river there, the ice is broken, the river's going through. There they are doing it. The material was shipped, as I said, and then assembled. Something Amazon, only it was over 5 years, over 4,000 miles. It's on time and it was on budget, by the way. Not like today's things. These guys were incredible. Here's a view. This is an artist's impression. It's only an impression. It's not accurate because it leaves out the other things. People used to walk on the ice when it froze up and see the bridge. They looked at it. It's a big tourist attraction. Okay, and you can see you could drive a horse over it, and they did. People would come and watch it being. It's a winter impression of the bridge. They only worked in one winter. The men only worked through the winter once at the very end in 1859 to finish it in 1860. It's the only time they worked through the winter. They used to pay the men off, and they struggled to live for a couple of months. But they did. But there's something tells you what the river was like, and people would come and see this thing being built. Now, the Victoria Bridge was important. You see from this map, there's the island of Montreal there. It linked Montreal to Portland and Maine, which was an ice-free port. Montreal's rivers froze in the winter, so you couldn't send ships to Montreal in the winter, and that stopped everything. People were laid off and so on. Factories didn't work. But when they built this bridge, it went all the way down here. It took trade from the States. Americans didn't like that, by the way. They take timber, wheat coming down the Ottawa River, all this wheat. Montreal grew enormously just because of the railway. They brought in huge amounts, and then they could ship it out here. And a lot of it was American stuff. The other thing that happened, they had all these trains running. So in the summer, they used to bring in coal from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. They were very aware of the importance of the Victoria Bridge. They realized it meant a lot of money, and that's going to be transmitted in a minute into political action. They knew that this railway generated wealth because Montreal boomed, and they said they made a lot from it. So they didn't just have factories working year round, they had a whole lot of other advantages as an inland port. The Maritime Provinces linked in 1867. The bridge finished in 1860. 7 years later, the Maritime said, we want parts of Canada. And the reason was they knew they'd get the railway. Okay, so Canada built the railways, but the railways built Canada. Now, here's what happened in Montreal. This is the Lachine Canal before the Victoria Bridge was constructed. The reason they built a canal is, for those of you who don't know, there's the Lachine Rapids. And in the summer, the ships can only sail as far as Montreal. You can't sail any farther because of the rapids. That's why Montreal became an important inland port, because we are miles up the river, but the river froze in the winter. So they built this small canal in the 1820s, you know, for the fur trade, some little bit of trade. That's what happened in the Lachine Canal. But after the bridge was built, look what happened. You see, this is a Lachine Canal, double locks, by the way, 2 locks, one ship can go up, other ship can go down. Over here, you see the factory starting. This is the bridge way in the background there. There's the train coming in. There's the giant ramp. But you see all the goods here. As I say, I repeat, Montreal was the world's largest inland port because of this for many years. This changed over the years, and the Lachine Canal became the cradle of Canadian industrialization. That's, you can see, this is a scene, look at the smoke. That's from the Maritimes, you thank them for that. But you can see all the goods left here. Montreal was a huge, thriving place. That doesn't mean to say that workers were paid very much, they weren't. But there was lots of jobs, lots of people. Self-help was important. One of the things that happened on the bridge, they had mechanics, the Mechanics Institutes, now the Atwater Library, was set up, and they'd help the workers to be retrained at night. So the idea was to make the mechanic a better man and the man a better mechanic. The Victorians had a different attitude to life than we did. They valued self-help in the way that we say, oh, we want the government to help us. Don't get me wrong, it was very brutal life if you were poor, but the Industrial Revolution started here in Montreal. Now, I've been very positive about the railways, but there were some major problems caused by the railways. Time used to be measured by each town at high noon. So you had a clock in Toronto, high noon is the, you know, that's 12 o'clock. In Montreal, high noon. But the trains were run. Sanford Fleming, he was the chief engineer. He said, right, we're going to run the trains in Montreal time. We don't care which time you say. But that's 8.5 minutes faster, and it's 23 minutes faster than Toronto time. So if the train left at 11:30, Montreal time, it's only about 11:10 Toronto time. It used to cause major problems because the train, Sanford Fleming, he was a Highland Scot, I'm a Lowland Scot, but he was a Highland Scot, he was a bit tyrannical, he was an engineer. There's no real difference between us, but just that the Lowland Scots are a bit better looking than them. But anyway, you see the big problems this causes. But you don't have to know the local times. In the United States, it's even worse. Here's what they had to face. Look at this. This is noon in Philadelphia. It's 12:04 in New York, and it's 12:06 in Albany. This was posted at the railway station. It caused mass confusion. Okay, so we were actually, for one, but not once, we were actually far more advanced using time. We had to deal with time before the Americans did, and we dealt with it in a different way, in a faster way. But how was this solved? Sanford Fleming's, that's the guy there. Very important. It's a shame, there's no memories to him in Montreal. He's lived in Montreal. He's one of the most important scientists in any country because he created standard time zones in Canada. He said, look, we're running this. Toronto and Montreal are going to have the same time. And the government agreed. So we created giant time zones. So you didn't have this problem of different times. But he also lobbied Britain and the United States. And he said to the Americans, look, you want to cooperate with us and trade, you've got to have the same time system as we are. Said to the Brits, you're sending ships across and they were steamboats, you've got to have the same time as we have. So they all cooperated, and Greenwich was established as the location of time zones and measured. It was then called the Greenwich Mean Time. It's a different name today, but if you go there, one of the famous tours, I've been there, you go there, you stand with one foot in the left hemisphere, one foot in the western hemisphere. Thousands of tourists do that every year, get the photographs taken. It was called Greenwich Mean Time. But standard time came about because of the Canadian railroads, because of Sanford Fleming. And I'm afraid he's forgotten by us. But if you go to Greenwich, he's remembered there, he's remembered in England, but not here. Now, I've been a bit positive about railways, but they had problems, as I said. Here is a typical setting. They had to be socialized to travel in trains. They weren't used to it. So here's what it looked like inside the train. People, this guy with his feet up in the thing, this man is fighting with this man, this guy's asleep. It was pandemonium inside the trains. And you used to have the guards would come around and they had mass fights. Okay? So long distances were often very uncomfortable. And the rail lines, though, allowed crowds to travel to other towns. And one of the impacts was sports leagues were born in Canada. Here in Montreal's playing Toronto for the World Championship across. The Brits often laugh at the Americans saying, oh, they have baseball World Championship because nobody else plays baseball. Well, we beat them in the 19th century. We had lacrosse championships and nobody else played lacrosse. But that was the first game. It wasn't hockey. Lacrosse was the most popular game. It's a summer game taken from the First Nations. And in this thing, Montreal, they were an Irish Catholic team. We played Toronto with an Irish Protestant team. And there was bad blood between the two of them. But the trains carried sometimes thousands. It was amazing. Just like today, people watch hockey, they watch lacrosse. And people came up, trainloads of people came up from Toronto to watch this game. But I'm afraid it was entirely corrupt. The refs were bribed, the timekeepers were bribed. And actually, the story is, different stories about this, but the Toronto team should have won, but they disallowed their various goals. And so they didn't like it. The crowd, there was heavy betting and bribery. At the end of the match, normally, if you look at a soccer match where that happens, the crowd invades the pitch and sometimes throws things at the players. But this is the 19th century, very different. The Toronto team attacked the crowd with the Royal Lacrosse and they chased them away from the stand. Okay, so Victorian times are very different to today. Okay, so I mentioned this. I think this is, I think it's very interesting. But here's another example. This is a cartoon. It's an exaggerated example, but you can see what it was like getting on the trains. This is a big problem they had. They used to sit on the roof of the train, and they had a big problem getting them off. And you see, this is an exaggeration, but the crowds were very difficult to handle. Don't think of everybody like today lining up. to go on the train. They had a mass charge for the train. They learned to line up much later. The Victorians were not the people that we think they were. We Canadians had to be socialised, to be civilised to travel up on trains. That's how the railways built Canadian conduct, if you like. They encouraged high speed. They ran these cheap holiday slots on a Sunday. And one of the bad things that occurred, they'd picnic on the rails. And the trains coming to get them off the rails. With flag, they used to have guys sitting in front of the train, get off the rails. Okay, so life with the railways wasn't quite what we imagined. But what it did, the Canadian coat of arms is I'd marry, I'd marry. Canada goes from sea unto sea. That was the motto. And so it meant linking Canada by rail in the 1880s, 1890s. You know, they wanted, British Columbia wanted in. The only way we could link up, we had to close the space with railways. There's a big philosophy about railways. Place, space, and time are altered. Don't worry about that, but you can see what happens. Toronto used to be 3 or 4 days travel away from us. Now it's 8 or 9 hours by train. So space was changed, made much closer because of time. And so the Grand Trunk Railway began manning. This is Sanford Fleming again. He was the chief surveyor for the Canadian Pacific Railway. Many of the guys went over and worked for them to build the line across Canada. But here's the interesting thing. Montreal built the tracks and trains that went across Canada. Because what happened is the Grand Trunk set up workshops in Montreal to service their engines. You know, when they needed to service them. Then they realized they might as well build them in Canada. So the Canadian, this is something that, again, the Canadians should know. We didn't just cross the country. We built the trains and the rails to cross the country. And I think that's a very important point. And here is something. Most people will show you the last spike where Donald Smith, who's another Highland Scot, as I said, he was the guy that puts in the last spike. There's only a few people, but he's an important guy. This is the last train, the first train to cross Canada, arriving in Vancouver. Vast crowds of people came to see it. It was a thing that the people wanted. People liked trains. Okay, and I think this shows it very well. They appreciated the coming of the train from Montreal. It ran from Montreal right across the country. But I think it's important to realize ordinary folk were deeply affected by rail. Most of the track, as I said, it was manufactured in Canada. Industrialization had migrated from Britain. One of the things that happened, this is a Russian Jewish family boarding a train. They used to get immigrants to come. They'd get on a train, they could buy a ticket in Berlin or Moscow. It took you all the way to the prairies. You got on a train, go to Bremen in Germany, cross to Britain, get to Liverpool, then you get a Liverpool boat to Montreal or Halifax, then the train took you to the west. You could get a ticket to do that. So well over 1 million people came to do that. They served millions over the years, several million immigrants came to Canada that way. And as I said, I put this one in because they had pogroms in Russia. Even then, the Russians were driving people out. Many of the Jewish people left because of that. One thing we do forget, at the east, we had Chinese workers working the railway from the east. You see the picture of them. They were quite badly treated, as you know, but they migrated eastwards. Something we forget, to BC, from BC to the rest of Canada. And you get Chinese communities in Ontario, Quebec, Maritimes, and they date from the 1880s. But they were, you all know about the head tax. They were discriminated against, and they were regarded as just as cheap labor, and the labor unions didn't want them because these guys would work cheaper. But we also imported from China in the 19th century tea, spices, crockery sent across the continent by train, and the silk trains were very important. They came to Canada, USA. They had armed guards. So Canada was importing stuff. We always complain, oh, they're getting cheap stuff from China. We've always imported cheap stuff from China, right? And some very good stuff from China. Silk. It was a lot of money. And Canada made a lot of money selling the silk to the Americans. Okay, so try and keep that in mind, that they ended an eastward movement as well as a westward movement. But I've been very positive about it. This is one of the sad things. These are the home children, the little immigrants arriving in Montreal. They were the orphans, unwanted children, sometimes handicapped children who were put in the workhouses in Britain. And the British realised, put them in a boat, take them to Canada, give them the fare to somewhere else. So they sent these workhouse children to Canada. 30,000 came to Quebec. Okay, again, I'm afraid they're ignored in Canadian history. As I said, it was cheaper to pay the fares. The Brits would pay the fares. Sometimes the parents didn't even know they had gone. And one of the sad things about them, I've read some of the Quebec history books, it really gets me annoyed. A lot of these guys in the First World War joined the Canadian Army to go to Britain. And they were called, even they were supporting the British Empire. Why do you think they went to Britain? Why did they join the army? These were poor ones. Well, they joined the army. It's a cheap way of getting to see your granny in Dublin or Liverpool, whatever. They wanted to trace their relatives. So they enlisted in the Canadian Army in mass numbers, not to defend the British Empire, but to try and track their relatives. I've actually met some of them. And they really, quite rightly, disliked Britain. Because they said, Britain didn't want me, they sent me here. Okay, and it's very sad, and we keep that in mind. The railways had a downside as well. Here's one of the upsides. This is the postman. This is the train going past. And what he's doing, he had a bag, he put it on a hook, and the train doesn't stop. It picks up the bag, and there's another hook, it drops off a bag for him to deliver. So even though the train didn't stop, it really made a big difference in rural areas with the mail system. And one of the other big changes towards the end of the 19th century, they actually employed women. Women were tremendously discriminated against in Victorian times, but one of the few jobs you could do was mail sorting. Okay, that was regarded as it's okay for women to sort the mail. A lot of the jobs they weren't allowed to do, but the railways did. But I think the man is supervising them, I'm afraid. But anyway, there's one job. Before the mail service was unreliable. But here's what happened in the rural areas. They get these pack horses, go to where the train would drop off the mail, and they put them in pack horses and they deliver them to rural areas a long way from the railway. So the railway had a big impact on the rural areas. And they went to the Canadian Mail then was very, very progressive, very dynamic. It was quicker and more efficient. And here's the gold rush. They actually delivered the mail by train line, then the sled dogs and pack horses. Here's the camp and the gold rush. Here's all the miners. They dump all the mail out and they're trying to get their mail. But the mail did deliver. I tried to get a map of the timber camps. I think they did the same thing here, but I don't know. I suppose they did. So you can see the idea here was to get the mail to people. And that's one of the big improvements in Canadian life. One of the things that happened at the end of the mail order, you could order mail from a catalogue. You could order goods from a catalogue. And it's been forgotten now, but Eaton's was the biggest one. They set up these catalogues, they sent them out, and you could order things through the mail, and it came quite quickly. You could even order a bride. Okay, now we laugh at that, but we have dating sites. They didn't have dating sites. They used to put the bride or the groom on the pictures, and you could select your bride or your groom. I don't know how they delivered them, but I'm knocking the door, here's your bride. I don't know, but you see, but there was a huge increase in traffic in the 19th century. So the need for 2 tracks. So they put 2 tracks down, they took the tube off, and you see it began to look like the bridge today. They took it off in 1900, the metal tube removed, they had a standard gauge. One of the handicaps in the railways, each company ran a different gauge. So the government said, enough of that, you're all going to have the same gauge. So they double tracked it, but it closed for traffic only one day. They took the tubes off before, they closed the bridge on a Saturday night at midnight. They employed all the workers at the go. They employed over 10,000 people in the Montreal region alone. And they double tracked it all, it closed for only one day. And then on the Monday, the trains ran on time.
Wow.
Incredible feat. You know, I'm afraid it makes what we do look quite bad. But then it evolved even more. They had an electric tram going over to the South Shore. You could get an electric train. They put a sign on it. Then they took the trams off. They had automobiles on both sides. They were added later on. So the bridge evolved over time. And it was the last big adaptation was the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1950s at St. Lambert. And here you can see this is the original bridge going here. So they added an extra side there. But this is the locks here. This thing could go up and let the ships in or down here. So these went up and down according to the traffic flow. Okay, the idea that the automobiles didn't stop. But one thing, it was adapted for the seaway in the 1950s, but I think it's quite limited because I think it's the most flexible and economically viable infrastructure we ever built in Canada. It's still there. But I'll just make one sort of snarky comment. If you look at the Lachine Canal, they had 2 sets of locks. If you go there now, there's a giant lineup of ships going through the canal. I used to take my children there and we'd watch the ships going through the canal. It's a great thing to watch. But the Victorians, I think in some ways a lot clever, they had 2 sets of locks going. We only have 1. But I repeat, it's an incredibly adaptive piece of infrastructure, and it's highly influential on ordinary people. And I think that's why the Victoria Bridge is one of the best pieces of infrastructure that Canadians have ever made. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Okay. A couple of questions. One is, where did they get the stone?
Up the St. Lawrence and New Point Clare, huge quarries there. They put them on rafts, so it was cheaper to send it downstream. That's where they got most of the stone. They also get stone from a few other places, but that was the main place. And it was cheap to do it. Just put them on a raft, down it goes to the river. It's delivered, you know, on time too. And there's a story. John Young, one of the guys that owned shares for the bridge, his house was built of the same stone as the Victoria Bridge, and he had a big spyglass set up at the top of his house so he could watch the workers working in the bridge to make sure they were working. Okay, so there's lots of good stories. But sorry, well, another question.
Yeah, well, one of the things I find quite impressive is that the stoneworks, the abutments are still in excellent shape, whereas all the concrete is deteriorating and has to be replaced. And you're right about Sir Stanford Fleming, because even to this day, as a railroad engineer, much of the infrastructure is still used to this day and does not have to be replaced.
Good question. I read all of the New York Times articles. The Americans really didn't like this bridge. They were very jealous of it. And one of the American interviewers said to Barassi, who built it, "How long do you think this is going to last?" He said, "Forever." They got pretty. But the New York Times, they said the infrastructure, they should have built it out of timber. It's much cheaper. And he said, no, it's not. It's right. And they were, I don't know why there were such good engineers then, but they really knew the stuff.
The other question I had was, I saw in a Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa, they had this construction of the bridge. And one of the unique things was that where they picked to cross, it was very, very shallow. Extraordinarily shallow from what I know. It's like about 5 meters or something like that.
Well, no, you're right. They had sounding. They took all these soundings of the river. And it was one of the reason they landed on the immigrants, it was one of the narrowest, shallowest places. So I didn't mention that, but they didn't want to dig too deeply. It was wide, but shallow. Okay. It was wider than it was today. And so they didn't have to go down that much. But they took these soundings over several years, and they said, here's where we're going to go. No, it's a good point. I didn't mention that. Sorry. Yeah.
It started out as a single track bridge.
Yeah.
Then they doubled it.
Yeah.
And then they added lanes for cars.
Yes.
How is it that the substructure that the supports and everything could handle all that expansion? Do they have some foresight in doing that, or
no? They didn't have foresight. but they had a giant iron thing, tube on top of it, weighed a huge amount of, huge weight. And then they worked that out. You needed that's what they needed to carry the weight of the iron tube, which was huge. And it was the first in the world to be like that. And no, it's a good point. I don't really know, but these engineers were Stevenson, the chief engineer. I read American things about him. He was regarded as the best engineer in the 19th century. So
you're saying that the structures, the stone structures underneath can handle everything that they put on top.
so far, no, I don't say everything. I don't know where the limits are, but they haven't reached them yet.
No.
Sorry, is another question?
How long do you think it took to build the bridge?
Well, 4 or 5 years, depending how you measure it, how they started. So they actually started by measuring it on. It took them a year just to measure it. But they don't usually count it. The actual construction took about 4 years. Oh, it was a record-breaking thing, and depends what you mean by start and finish. See, they didn't really. They did the top of it was done about a year later. They cut the tube to ventilate it because people were being choked inside, and so it depends what you mean by finish. And it's a good question, though. Good question. Yeah.
The engineers at that time had the foresight to build it to stop the ice from damaging it.
Yes.
How is it that the modern engineers didn't see that when they built the Champlain Bridge? They had to build an icebreaker bridge.
Good point. Great point. Well, no, he's right. He's right. Absolutely right. They didn't have the foresight. Well, I'll tell you a story about the Champlain. Another criticism of the Champlain. I used to live in St. Lambert to get the bus over, and I was on the new bridge, and we were watching the old bridge being demolished. And I was standing there, and I happened to know this older couple sitting there, and they knew me. We got talking, and they said, "Oh, we've just come back from a big meal in the town. It's our wedding anniversary today." I said, "Oh, that's really nice." He said, "Yeah, we've been married. Our marriage has lasted longer than the Champlain Bridge." And no, it's a good point, though. The cost of building that extra ice-breaking thing must have been enormous, and I don't know why. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know that. That's a good point.
I have one question, a person that wants to ask a question online. You can come off mute and ask your question.
Okay, it's me that I wanted to ask the question. I just like to know, this gentleman who's given this whole thing for us today, does he know about other bridges that were going in Montreal? Because I have my great grandfather who was apparently a bridge inspector, and he was in the, like, I have a whole booklet. I don't know who I could share it with, and it's a whole article about I think he was Inspector General of the General Construction. He was a Scottish engineer from Motherwell. I just didn't know if you knew anything about it, or would you like to see this book? I don't know what
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. Well, that's where Motherwell is actually an industrial. I was actually born next to Motherwell. It's a big industrial plant area, and that's why they had these engineers. No, that would be great. You're right about the inspection. I know that recently, about 10, 15 years ago, they inspected one of the bridges, and they said, "Oh, the paint company hadn't done its work properly." But the paint company took the government to court and won, because they told them what the government had to do, and the maintenance procedures were not followed. And that's why the bridge was deteriorating, that the government had ignored the company's advice, saying, "Here's what you have to do to keep this bridge going," and they didn't do it. Okay.
I would love to share this book with you, and I don't know where you're located, but he was also he worked for the Montreal Water and Power General Construction, 1876, I think it is.
Yeah, well, see, the water was a big problem. That's one of the most expensive of the local infrastructure, is to build water pipes. Everybody laughs at that, but it's incredibly expensive to replace the pipes. And apparently the Victorian pipes are much better than the modern ones. They're lasting longer. And see, you have to keep water running. You can't just say, "We're going to shut the pipe off and stop the water." You've got to build 2 lots of pipes, keep for the new one and the old one. And that's why Montreal's having big water problems. And with all these new skyscrapers, near the Peel Canal, they're going to have major problems because of the water. But you have to take
Victoria Lodge. Does that? I don't know if it has anything to do with the Victoria Bridge, but they call it the Victoria Lodge.
Called what, the Victoria Lodge?
This Mount Horeb, chapter 6, 1847 to 1913. And it's called I guess it's the Mason Lodge, but they call it Victoria Lodge.
Oh, well, it could be the Masons, that's an organization. They're not really bridge masons, but it's just a name.
Okay.
They used to be masons who built. Sorry, if you email, I'll email. Yeah, we'll link up after this.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you. I'd like to see the book. Thank you.
I
Sam,
have, I have another question. How did they ventilate the giant iron tube?
Well, they didn't at first, and when the prince went over, it caused a big kerfuffle because the poor old prince was almost choked, and he was a big media star. He was like Princess Diana today. The New York Times didn't bother with the bridge. They wrote all about the prince and the dances and the balls and all that stuff. The prince went over the bridge and had a tough time. They did it just by putting a traveller up, and they just cut a big trench on top of it, and then that ventilated they didn't think about that one. So the engineers, they weren't that good, They were
Sam?
fallible.
Sam,
Yes.
what happened to all the employees after the bridge was completed?
Well, some went back to Britain, many went to the States, many came up to rural areas, up where I am in northern Quebec. A lot of them bought farms. Buying a farm was very important, because if you owned a farm, you could get your family fed, you could vote, your own property, and your livelihood was pretty well assured. But many of them set up small businesses in the Lachine Canal area, and they were very successful. They really boomed. There were just a great many millionaires came from industrial things, and you forget that the Industrial Revolution started on the Lachine Canal area, and it made a few people very rich. I mean, the poor people were still poor, but in the winter, no, we had dreadful poverty in Montreal. It was, life was tough.
Thank you.
I've got a question about the rivets. There are lots of rivets put on this thing. Now, usually a rivet has a head on one side and
Yes.
it's got a shaft. Did they have to heat those rivets?
Yes.
before? They heat
Yes.
all their-
The young boys, they had big tongs, boys had big tongs, and they put the rivets into the fire, little fires, and the coke fires, coal, not coal, and the boys would put them in, they heat up, they had these tongs, they'd catch them, and the guy the boy would get it. They had two men, one man would be standing up and one man with a giant hammer. The man up above would catch it, put it in the hole, and the other guy would hit it. But sometimes they said the boy would throw it up and the man missed it and it fell down on the boy. And there were a couple of cases where the boy screamed and fell off into the water. But I repeat, these guys stayed in Montreal. They weren't just riveters. They became mechanics as well. They went to the Mechanics Institute and they had all these books about how to progress. They were self-help guys. And a lot of the Irish Catholics were sort of frowned upon by the Irish Protestants. They were very successful in Montreal. They were educated, they became educated, and a lot of some of our Brian Mulroney's probably descended from some of these guys. So it was upward social mobility.
So these rivets were red hot.
They were red hot.
And they stuff them in the hole.
Stuff it in the holes and bash it in. And it
Did
would,
they come from Britain too, or did we?
yes, the rivets all came from Britain. See, rivets were pounded by steam hammers. That's why the Americans came up. They wanted to get the technique, and they didn't have it. And if you read American books, they came over with British riveters. Read Canadian books. I had a big argument with in Ontario. I went to the Economics Association conference, and they were on about the Industrial Revolution in Hamilton and Oshawa. And I said, what are you talking about? It was the Lachine Canal. And they had a giant argument. They didn't believe the Industrial Revolution started in Montreal. These were economists. So there's a lot of false stories flying around, I'm afraid, in Canadian history. But as I say, I repeat, we don't give enough congratulations to the workers who did that. Because these guys came over very often with nothing, and they became valuable employees or working, you know, they started their own businesses. They were valuable people. But they were valued to us. They weren't valued in Britain, but they were valued here. And I think that's a nice compliment for Canada.
I
Yeah,
have a
so-
picture of all the people that worked on the railroad, including Louis Riel, Sir Sanford Fleming, William Van Horn, all the men that worked on the railroad. Now, Sir
Don't think
Sanford
Louis-
Fleming,
I don't know though. I may be wrong.
uh,
I know Scott did, the guy that he shot. Thomas Scott was he worked on the railroad, but I don't think Riel. I don't know. Sorry.
I just missed out.
Sorry.
Yeah, just to add